My name is Julianne Bell, and I am an elementary school resource teacher. Now, in this podcast, I use the terms difference, disability, disorder, mental health, and mental illness almost interchangeably. However, terminology can be loaded with history and emotion. So please, check in with the individuals and communities you are working with to touch base regarding the terms that you are using. Today, we will be spending some time chatting about mental health supports for students in Alberta. In particular, students with obsessive-compulsive disorder. The medical disability information for Alberta teachers states, obsessions are persistent thoughts, impulses, or images that cause significant distress. Compulsions are repetitive behavior such as hand-washing, ordering, and checking, or mental acts such as praying, counting, or repeating words silently that a person feels compelled to do to prevent or reduce distress. Obsessive-compulsive disorder is a psychiatric condition in which obsessions or compulsions are severe enough to be time-consuming, cause marked distress, or interfere with everyday functioning. It is estimated that 25% of Canadians will have an anxiety disorder in their lifetime, and that 1% of Canadian children are diagnosed with OCD. However, specialists think that cases go underreported. OCD is an invisible disability, which means it's not noticeable by simply looking at a person. Today, I've invited my brother Samuel Bell in to share his lived experience of OCD and education in Alberta.
Hello, I'm Sam. I'm a 27-year-old pharmacist in Fort McMurray, Alberta. A lot of my free time is spent playing video games and working with computers. I've lived with OCD and panic disorder my whole life.
Welcome, Sam. Could you please share your experience living with OCD?
Living with OCD is an interesting experience. I would say generally it feels negative, but it's definitely given me an outlook on life that's different, and I hope that I can use to help other people.
What are some of your most prominent memories about OCD and your education?
One moment that really stood out for me during school, I remember describing how when I saw a fire alarm, I'd have a weird urge to pull it, or rather a fear that I would pull it, even though I knew I never would. And I tried to discuss this with people, and even though it's to someone who's familiar with it, a very common sign of OCD, nobody had a recognition of it. In high school, I was terrified of catching HIV from, say, body fluids on the ground, like urine or a bit of blood. Terrified of meningitis. University was definitely the worst because they don't care about mental health at all. I tried to get someone to take notes for me through the student disability services. They wanted a formal diagnosis from a doctor. It's an unnecessary roadblock. I mean, if I go to a doctor and I say I'm anxious and admit this, go through a bunch of red tape and waiting processes, and ultimately it's all based on what I've said anyways. So I just feel like they were there more as a roadblock.
What kind of supports were available for you throughout your education?
There wasn't a lot of support available for me when I was in school. There was a school counselor, but unfortunately in Alberta they don't really need to have any significant training or qualifications. I'm sure she was perfectly fine, but not equipped to deal with those kind of issues.
Samuel brings up an interesting point about school counselors in Alberta. According to the Canadian Counselling and Psychotherapy Associations, Alberta is the only province that does not require specific coursework or training in counseling in order to act as a school counselor. Furthermore, it is a requirement to have a school counselor in some divisions and provinces. However, this is inconsistent across Alberta. When asked about what teachers should know to better support students who may have OCD, Sam responded,
I think one of the most important things for teachers is familiarity with screening tools and with at least a cursory introduction to diagnostic criteria. If students are exhibiting these behaviors, they need to be able to reach out. Some sort of professional training would be ideal. I've had OCD aspects of my behavior for as long as I could remember. In grade 4 and prior to that, I would go home very frequently with a feeling I thought was nausea, but I think it was kind of the prodrome of anxiety. Having it identified in itself is very helpful because you don't realize that what you feel inside isn't what usually is felt inside by people. Having that outside explanation of, this is something that's different and this is how you can deal with it. It's not just you're weird or bad. That's very helpful.
One such screening tool is the Children's Yale Brown Obsessive Compulsive Scale. According to a guide released by Anxiety BC, some examples of obsessions and compulsions to watch for include fear of contamination, which may include excessive hand washing, just right, so spending significant amounts of time completing or repeating an action, excessive doubting, so frequent checking for reassurance. Other ways OCD may show up in the classroom include difficulty concentrating and remembering, high absenteeism, avoidance behaviors, limited social interaction, and difficulty with academics. According to the 2016-2017 Alberta Special Education Coding Criteria, students with OCD may be entitled to special education funding if they have a diagnosis from a psychiatrist, psychologist, or pediatrician, along with documentation about the nature and severity of the disorder. They may be coded as a CORD2, or severe emotional and behavioral disability. Students with OCD would then become eligible for a treatment and behavior plan with efforts put towards access to appropriate mental health and therapeutic services. In some cases, these students may also be placed in specialized settings. When asked about special education for students with OCD, Sam's response was,
I don't think that segregation is useful. Ultimately, in society, you need to be integrated. And it's almost like a cruel joke that you get this support network until high school and then it's cut off right there. I'm on a pretty severe end of an anxiety and OCD spectrum. I've had times when I couldn't leave my house. Thankfully, I've had a lot of improvement.
What are your thoughts on the growing movement to reduce the stigma associated with mental disorder?
I really don't agree with the idea that we shouldn't pathologize abnormal behavior. It seems like it's helpful. Everyone's special in their own different way. And there's a lot of things where, wider acceptance is great. But the thing is, in the end, it is a disorder. If we just call it like a difference, then, these people aren't getting the help that they need. There's nothing pleasant about OCD. Bipolar disorder some people find the mania pleasant. Other people find it extremely unpleasant. But there's ups and downs. There are no ups to OCD. It's awful.
Samuel brings up classification, which is a point of controversy within the mental health and the disability community. Those in favor of classification argue that it is a useful way to organize information. This information can be used to identify causes and treatment. Furthermore, from an educational perspective, classification is a way to identify students who require more intensive treatments and resources. Those opposed to classification argue that those with disability and difference experience the world widely varying ways. As such, one gains more information on an individual basis rather than by diagnosis. Furthermore, some argue that disability and difference are only limiting because of the societal barriers that exist. As well, those opposed to classification argue that diagnosis contributes to existing stigma and stereotypes about those with difference, disability, and disorders. You've mentioned that people may not recognize OCD. A lot of what people understand about difference and disability is what they see on TV or movies. What are your thoughts on portrayal of OCD in the media?
I think of Sheldon Cooper or Monica from Friends. I think that OCD, there's not really any stigma or serious stigma about it, but it's also very understated. People would get the idea that it's just kind of silly, likes to clean a lot, and there's a lot more depth to it. And I think it would be very interesting to have somebody with OCD portrayed in the media, at least in a regular TV series or something.
What do you think is the biggest misconception that people have of OCD?
This goes back to the media portrayal. People think about OCD as being a clean freak, that kind of thing, but a lot of the more distressing manifestations people aren't too familiar with. Intrusive thoughts, fears, rituals, that kind of thing. I had no idea I had OCD until I looked at a screener and I was like, whoa, like this quiz describes me 100%.
What are your thoughts on the advantages of living with OCD?
Some of my behaviors that some people think are OCD, I just think are reasonable. Like I don't share food with people generally unless it's in my close family. I wash my hands very well. But if people were even half as careful as I am, there'd be so much less illness. C. difficile, all these nasty diseases are still getting through. Proper hand washing would save lives.
Well, Sam, thanks so much for speaking with us today.
Thanks for taking the time to talk to me. I really enjoy getting my thoughts out there. If I can help even one child, one other person, then excellent. And I hope that as we move into coming generations, we can provide these support networks. It's a very serious mental illness, and I hope that people can learn and expand on that.
In today's podcast, Sam shared that the greatest support for his OCD was identification, his disorder. That is why the bulk of the podcast is focused on identification. There's a great deal teachers can do to support children and families with mental difference and disability. Fortunately, Alberta is taking steps in the positive direction. Sam shares a rather bleak experience with mental health and education in Alberta in terms of increasing access to mental health resources and understandings. Alberta has released a document titled Working Together to Support Mental Health in Alberta Schools. This includes relevant information regarding mental health and well-being. In the video description, I have included some resources for teaching students with obsessive compulsive disorder. I hope that you've learned something new today and have something to add to your teaching toolkit.